Well, young people are getting more and more of their news on social media from influencers, but many are loose on the facts. Here to help us dissect this new news world is Colette Bryn from Laval University. She's watching how content creators make news waves online. And with some fascinating stats on news influencers in the U.S., we have Galen Stocking from the Pew Research Center. Great to have you both.
Great to be here.
Great to be here.
Colette, let's talk big picture. I mean, social media is now a major source of news. What does the public need to understand about this shift taking place that maybe they might be missing?
Well, influencers are really big, especially with younger audiences in terms of news. I mean, people are really appreciating the way influencers or content creators, as we call them now, engage with their audiences, with their communities. So it's a much more, personal, informal way of talking about topics. And they don't necessarily adhere to all the journalistic norms and principles that, we teach our journalism students. But some of them do. And some of them actually do a really, really good job of dissecting the news and making it understandable for people who may not have that much experience engaging with the news.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag for sure out there. Lots of influencers. Galen, you analyzed 500 popular news influencers and who had 100,000 followers or more, so big accounts. What were your key findings?
So we've looked at the influencers themselves and tried to figure out like their demographics and where they're spending their time and a few other factors. And we found first off that there's a large gender gap. About 2/3 of news influencers in the U.S. context are men, and about a third are women. Big differences there. We also looked at partisanship, and we found that 27% explicitly identify as being right-leaning, whether they're expressing a right-leaning ideology or that they are Republican or support Donald Trump. And then about 21% were left-leaning. So a gap there in between the parties among news influencers themselves.
In terms of, Galen, like the platforms, did your data look different depending on, who was on which platform?
Yeah, so I should set the context in that most news influencers are on X or Twitter. So 85% have an account on X as of last summer. And there's a big difference between the different platforms. So Facebook in particular is much more likely to be right-leaning, and all of the platforms have a right-leaning tilt to them among the news influencers, with the exception of TikTok, where it's fairly balanced, like a 3 percentage point gap.
That's important for people to know, just for the context of what they're consuming, depending where they're consuming it. One stat that was fascinating to me is that 77% of influencers in your study have no news affiliation or background in news. I'm sure, Colette, that there is some similarities across the border in Canada here. When you hear that stat, what goes through your mind?
Actually, what goes through my mind is that UNESCO did a study of this, and they're actually seeing that a lot of these influencers who don't have background in journalism are interested in learning about it. And they're actually going to be developing, training programs. And so they're trying to fill that gap, I guess. But of course, a lot of them are not interested in that at all. I mean, what they want is maximize engagement. And it's perhaps more opinion-based or more entertainment-based.
Infotainment is what we often hear, right, Colette? Then in that situation for Canadian influencers that you're watching, are you seeing them as, positive disruptors or dangerous then?
There's a bit of all of that. It was really interesting listening to Galen, and I really appreciate that approach of going through 500 accounts. We probably need some kind of study like that, because I'm associated with the Digital News Report, which is, of course, just a general population survey. So it's really hard when you're just asking people, a random sample of people, which are the influencers that you follow. You're not going to get a representative number of just the huge diversity of that. So there are, I'm trying to track them maybe a little bit more qualitatively, especially in the Francophone environment in Quebec. And there are some cases of journalists who actually decide to become influencers or content creators because they're freed from the constraints of a newsroom. And just recently, a few days ago, there was one in Quebec City who worked for Radio-Canada, and she was doing the kind of short vertical video formats for Radio-Canada, which was working really well. And she just recently announced that she's moving to YouTube. You know, she's leaving Radio-Canada, not because it's a bad organization, but because she wants to work outside of that very kind of bureaucratic structure.
Right.
So to really connect directly with younger audiences. And I'm sure she'll keep applying her professional standards, but it's an interesting development.
Galen, I want to come back to your stats in the U.S. I wonder about the consumers of this content. Like, do you have a breakdown demographically?
What we did see as a huge distinction is age. About twice as many younger adults under 30, are getting news from news influencers than overall. And especially if you compare younger adults to the oldest age cohort, there's huge gaps. So it's 37% of adults 18 to 29 are get news regularly from news influencers, and just 7% of those over 65.
Here in Canada, Colette, we have Bill C-18, right? The Online News Act, where the government wanted social media giants to pay news agencies for their content, but Meta said no, and news was banned entirely on Facebook and Instagram. Do you think the environment that law created led to more misinformation?
Well, it means that there's still a lot of misinformation that hasn't been banned from Meta platforms, because there's no one, there's not all of that context. But there are these influencers, some of these influencers who are filling that gap, and not always in a good way. And as Galen mentioned, especially younger audiences are much more, maybe less aware of what this means. Actually, the surveys we did and that other organizations did show that younger people are aware, and they are bothered by the fact that Meta is blocking access to news, but they're not necessarily changing their habits, or they're going to other social media platforms. So they're not going back to necessarily to apps or to websites of legacy organizations. And certainly we've seen over many years that younger people just haven't been socialized to legacy news. So they don't really see like any added value to that. And of course, that raises all kinds of questions for the future in terms of what is their engagement with news, with democracy, and what they consider to be fact-based information, as opposed to somebody doing some kind of entertaining content.
For sure. I mean, I met a young woman who was 18 that told me she didn't even know what the New York Times was. So some of us were like living in different worlds in terms of like consuming information. Galen, I'll end with you. Based on the trends you're seeing, are news influencers the future?
I think they're certainly here to stay in the short term. We have seen the trends of where people get news from go more and more towards getting news online, more and more towards getting news from social media, at least in the US context. And I can't comment on what's going to happen 5-10 years from now. It does seem like news influencers are certainly here to stay. Audiences say that news influencers help them better understand the world. Audiences say that news influencers are giving them news that they're not getting anywhere else. And so with that kind of demand there, I would expect that news influencers will be here, at least in the short term.
Yeah, they've definitely made the connection, and in some ways, the gaps that legacy media has left. Galen, Colette, great to have you on the show today.
Thanks for having us.